Morning, everyone. As you come in, we're going to give it just about a minute for more folks to join. And just for the folks that have come in subsequently, we're going to give it like 30 more seconds for people to join. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Will Flanders. I'm the research director here at Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, joined by Lauren, one of our attorneys, our associate counsel in education policy. And today we're going to talk to you about a couple broad topics that are sort of important in education. Right now, we're going to talk about our recent Apples to Apples report, which is a review of education sort of results in the state over the past year. We're also going to supplement that with some additional information from the NAEP and some national tests that are out there. Try to give you guys a little bit more than what's in the baseline document that you can find on our website. And then Lauren's going to discuss some of our recent cases and important issues in education policy more broadly. Just for anyone who's not familiar, and I'd imagine most of you folks are if you're on this call, but we're a law and policy center located in Milwaukee, and we are sort of engaged, across the policy and litigation spectrum on a number of different issues, including education policy chiefly, but also promoting limited government and transparency, and just generally trying to contribute to a better public discourse. And we're going to discuss some of our recent work here today. So we'll start with an overview of the changes to the education standards in the state that have taken place in the last couple of years. Then again, I'll discuss the Apples to Apples report, and then we'll transition to some of our legal findings. And just before we get into the meat of the presentation here, if folks have questions, feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will go through those at the end of the presentation. So just to paint a broad picture here to start out, what are the main issues that we're looking at currently? The thing with the broadest implications right now is that DPI last year lowered the standards for the forward exam. What essentially that means is that the threshold for proficiency, what it meant to be proficient in education, was lowered by DPI. And the problem that creates is that it makes it impossible to compare to past years. So just as an example here, in figure 1 on the side of the screen, that this is a sort of reproduction from our Apples to Apples report. You can see the red line, which is forward exam proficiency over time. You can see that sort of was on a downward trajectory since the COVID-19 pandemic, though with a little bit of a rebound in 2022 and 23 in the red line. But then the standards changed between 2023 and 2024, and you see a dramatic increase in proficiency from around 30-something% to over 50%. And that makes it very problematic in terms of assessing what's happening with education in the state, because we can no longer make comparisons to past years. Those years from 16 to 23 were directly comparable, but that's no longer the case. And so what we do in this Apples to Apples report, it's important to note, we're only looking at proficiency in this most recent year. So while we can no longer make those comparisons across years, and that's absolutely problematic, we still can compare school performance within school years, which is again what we're looking at in this report. Just some overall trends in terms of what we're seeing in education around the state. We continue to see declines in public school enrollment pretty universally, with a few pockets of exceptions statewide. We've gone from just under 870,000 students in 2016 to just over 800,000 students today. We're declining on average, we declined since 2016 about 6.7% around the state. Again, there are a few exceptions where districts are seeing growth, but as we think about our educational environment in the state and the different sectors that we have that we'll discuss subsequently here, this is something that all folks involved in education are going to have to deal with. The reality is that we're seeing declining birth rates. We have a policy environment that's sort of not leading to population growth overall. We don't have a lot of immigrants from within the United States to our state, and so our school population overall is going down pretty substantially and pretty dramatically. And the fact we have competition, we have the choice and charter sectors does play a role in that as well. Though declining birth rates is sort of the overall phenomenon. We simply don't have as many kids entering schools as we did in the past. And that leads to a lot of issues, right? That leads to problems with resources. It's because our school resources in the state are tied to enrollment. Resources for some districts may be dropping more rapidly than others. That leads to problems of, having to consider factors like consolidation. That's always a third rail of education politics. But as we see fewer and fewer kids enrolled in schools, it's something that's maybe on the board for more districts. And we see even on the school choice side, right, that the reality is we're in a district where the amount of customers, the amount of folks that can make choices is going down, and that's something all of us will have to deal with unless we see unexpected change on some of those kind of metrics. So we'll talk more about public schools as well, but we thought we'd start here with just an overview of school choice in the state. We have a number of school choice programs. Some of them are private school choice, and that's the first four programs mentioned here in Milwaukee, Racine, the statewide program, as well as the special needs scholarship program. The largest program on the private school side is still the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program with over 27,000 students. The WPCP, the Wisconsin program, is the fastest growing and now has more than 17,000 students. And then the SNSP is a program for students with disabilities. We have charter schools in the state as well. Those are public schools that are authorized by a number of different entities. Some of them are authorized by local school districts. Others are authorized by other authorizers like the OEO, which is the Office of Educational Opportunity through the University of Wisconsin, and a number of other authorizers as well. Over 50,000 students enrolled across all the different types of charter schools. And finally, we have the open enrollment program. And this is the largest school choice program in the state, is what we always say. And more than 70,000 students utilize that program. I showed you the overall trend in enrollment around the state, and this is the trend for our private school choice programs. The blue line is the MPCP, the Milwaukee program in blue. The green line that's sort of going up at the fastest rate is the statewide program. Again, actually, I think the previous slide was outdated. With our most recent year of data, we're actually over 20,000 students in the statewide program now. So even as we see declining enrollment in statewide public schools, we're seeing growing enrollment in our choice programs around the state. Though again, that doesn't fully explain the overall decline in enrollment in public schools around the state. So why do we do this apples to apples analysis? Well, one thing in my nearly a decade actually working on education policy up here that we've seen now is that we continue to see in the media these sorts of narratives like this from the Wisconsin Examiner below, that public schools, when you look at the overall results, are doing better than our private school choice, than our charter schools around the state. But what's often missed in these sort of headline, headline and the articles as well, is that they're often dealing with different groups of students. And from both the public school perspective and the school choice perspective, in terms of comparing student outcomes, it's important to account for things like student economic status. We also know that Wisconsin has some of the largest racial achievement gaps in the country, so it's important to account for factors like that as well. It's important to account for disability, though that's more challenging with the data. That's something we won't fully get into in this discussion today, but it's something that's an important factor to consider as well. So if you ignore those factors, right, the narrative is that public schools are recovering faster, doing better. But if you account for those factors, that the picture to some extent tends to be different. And so that's what we try to do in this apples to apples analysis, is put the schools on a level playing field based on all these factors in a statistical model, control for these things. And then we see both on the public school side and the choice side, which schools and school districts sort of rise to the top. Again, this sort of goes through what I said on the previous slide, but at the bottom here of the slide, you can see some of the main factors we account for. One I didn't mention before was a student grade level. Obviously, performance can tend to vary to some extent by grade level as well. So it's important to include those factors in making comparisons. So what is the state of student proficiency in Wisconsin? Even with DPI's changes, and this is on the right is just straight data from DPI as a starting point, we see about 51% of students in the state proficient in reading, 53% proficient in math. So even though we drastically lowered the standards, it's important to note that almost half of students still aren't reaching the thresholds of proficiency that the state is judging to be appropriate or sufficient levels of proficiency for grade level. And then we can also note that NAEP proficiency in Wisconsin continues to hover around in the 30% range. So whichever way you slice it, there's a large share of students that aren't sort of meeting expectations, either on the NAEP standard, which is tougher, or the Wisconsin standard, which is lower. We're still seeing more than 40% of students not reaching what's expected of them. I just put this chart in here because it's kind of striking. When we were testifying on AB1, which was a bill to sort of bring back the standard that DPI lowered earlier this year or last year, that I think we're going to discuss in more depth in the second half of this presentation. One of the senators mentioned there's no way that Wisconsin is lower in reading than Mississippi. I think his quote was, they may be doing better, but they have a long way to go. Well, this is the reality from the NAEP in Wisconsin over time. The blue line here represents Mississippi's reading proficiency on the NAEP, and the orange line represents Wisconsin proficiency. You can see our line is kind of stagnant, and then post-COVID, the last couple of years here is going down significantly. And then the blue line is making significant progress, and actually in this last round of the NAEP did earn a higher points or higher proficiency rate than Wisconsin on the fourth grade reading. Wisconsin is still higher in math, still higher in eighth grade reading, but when we're looking at what the future might hold, looking at these early grades is obviously critical. And what you're seeing here is that Wisconsin is on a downward trajectory, and states like Mississippi that deal with much worse levels of poverty, that deal with more challenging demographics in general, are on the better path, on the path to progress. And we're not going to talk too deeply about the science of reading in this report, but the progress of Mississippi, largely based on wide buy-in on implementation of the science of reading. We passed legislation here in the state of Wisconsin to implement the science of reading, but in a lot of different ways, there's been a dragging of feet, and there's been reticence to sort of buy into those changes. So, this I tweeted earlier, this should be a 5-alarm fire for folks involved in education in the state. But there seems to be a level of complacency and sort of ignoring this reality is happening. But we can now learn from states like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, where great progress is being made, while our state tends to be moving in the opposite direction. This chart's a little bit of, probably too extensive, but I'm happy to provide this data to any school district or folks from a school district that's interested. But one thing that this data allows us to do is to look at a school district's demographics and then make projections about what we expect the district would be doing versus what they're actually achieving. And then we can see which districts are some of the highest performers and which districts have some substantial room for improvement. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, you see the actual percent proficient in reading on the forward exam during this most recent round of the forward exam test. So for instance, North Lakeland had 82.9% proficient, but our model would only project them to have about 56% proficient, and therefore they're about 26% better than that. And so that makes it the highest performing district in the state relative to its demographic profile. On the other side, you see districts where proficiency was lower than would be expected. And you can see that, Union Grove High School is at the tops there. And you can do this for every district in the state. Again, I'm happy to share some of this data with folks that are interested. But there are wide disparities based on demographics and how well school districts are actually performing and how well they'd be expected to do given their demographic profile. So again, some of those factors like economic status, disability rates, et cetera. When we move into more of our analysis of sector by sector, what we see here first statewide is that our private schools participating in the choice program have significantly higher proficiency levels in both ELA, that's English language arts, and math. On average, our private schools in the choice programs were about 8% higher proficiency than what would be expected in a traditional public school in our analysis, and about 5% higher in math. Statewide, we saw a performance advantage for district charters in ELA. For independent charters, we did see a negative relationship for math, and virtual schools as well. We saw a negative relationship for math. It's important to note here at the bottom of the chart that we do in this analysis still see extensive racial and economic achievement gaps. The way you interpret those numbers is a hypothetical school that was 100% African American. You'd expect almost 28% lower proficiency in reading. And then for a school that was hypothetically 100% low income, you'd expect almost 38% lower proficiency in reading relative to school that had no low income students. So those big disparities are there, and they show up even in this analysis where we're sort of accounting for those factors directly. In Milwaukee, we see much more consistent overperformance by our choice and charter sectors. Both private schools and district charters and independent charters all see higher proficiency than traditional public schools in both ELA and in math. And those racial and economic achievement gaps are still present as well. But across the state, what we can say is we're seeing a performance advantage for private school choice very consistently, a little less of a performance advantage consistently for our charter sectors, but an advantage in some context there as well. I also looked at growth. And so, when we talk about students coming into the choice program, coming into charter schools, what you often hear from school leaders is that kids aren't making this decision to attend a choice and charter school because they're being well served or doing that well in the traditional public school. A lot of times, there are kids that are behind and that are looking for a school that fits their needs better. And when we look at the growth factor, all of our choice and charter sector rise to the top, both in Milwaukee and around the state. The results are more dramatic when you look at Milwaukee in the blue columns here, but there's consistent, statistically significant higher growth in our choice and charter sectors. For virtual schools, what we see in that case is we see no effect, no relationship, which is a little bit better, at least, than the results we saw on the previous screen with a lower overall proficiency. So just some general thoughts about what we're looking to do in Wisconsin. We're part of a coalition for education freedom, and we've supported closing the gap on funding, and that goal was achieved during the last legislative session. We still have a significantly lower spending level for our choice and charter sectors than our traditional public schools. Our average public schools in the state are now at about $18,000 per kid. Our voucher and independent charter amounts are in the $10,000 to $11,000 range, depending on grade level. So it's still a significant savings for taxpayers. And when you look at all the results that we've described on the previous screen, it's important to note that those represent a better bang for the buck for taxpayers because we're achieving more proficiency and better results at a lower taxpayer cost. But some of the barriers that remain in place for school choice is that we have income limits on the statewide program. The income limit for the Milwaukee and Racine program is 300% of the federal poverty limit. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen there what the sort of actual raw number income limit would be. So, for instance, for a family of four, about $61,000. We also have enrollment caps that are coming off. Next year is the last year of enrollment caps. That means that in 2 years from now, any student around the state that wants to enroll in a private choice program will be able to. But for the time being, those enrollment caps remain in place. Also, restrictive enrollment periods and grade entry level points. So as we think about on our school choice side, what are our policy goals going forward? Getting rid of some of these limitations are the keys. So with that, I think here, Lauren, it might actually be good to turn it over to you to discuss the imperfection stuff as well. That's one slide earlier that we talked about, but I will turn it over to you.
Yes. Hello. Thank you so much for that. So as just a brief overview, just to build off of what Dr. Flanders was just alluding to, there have been a couple of instances with the DPI where they have been preventing families from joining the choice program because of quote unquote imperfections in their application process. I say quote unquote because applicant names and addresses, according to the DPI, are supposed to match perfectly, but what does it mean to match perfectly? And a lot of times these different applicants were using shortened versions of their names or addresses, and that wasn't deemed to be good enough, and they were losing the opportunity to talk or to apply to the choice program just because they didn't have exactly perfect matching addresses or names on their applications. So thankfully, we were able to bring a lawsuit on this issue and won in the fall of 2023. So the court agreed with us that DPI should not be disallowing families who use shortened versions of their names and addresses from applying and accepting their applications to the choice program, which is a really good thing. But there's also a lot of things going on in the education space legally that I'm going to continue to talk about during this presentation. So I'm going to transition to dive into some of the state, local, and national legal highlights that Will has either been directly involved in or monitoring very closely. To demonstrate just how much is happening in education, I pulled examples from each level of government, but this doesn't even scratch the surface of all the things that are going on right now. So I'm going to start at the local level, and then we can work our way up to the national level. Back in June of 2023, the legislature passed Act 12, which allowed the city and county of Milwaukee to raise its sales tax. However, the legislature believed that if Milwaukee was going to receive millions of extra tax dollars each year, there were also going to need to be improvements that were made, particularly with safety. So in Act 12, a provision was added saying that Milwaukee Public Schools, or MPS, needed to have 25 school resource officers in schools by January 1st, 2024. School resource officers, according to the statute, are police officers that are assigned to a particular school district. The statute also requires these officers to be specifically trained by a National Association of School Resource Officers. Well, January 1st, 2024 came and went, and then February, and then March, then April, then May, then June, and until almost July, nothing was said about these school resource officers or the statutory requirement that they needed to be back in MPS schools. That is until Jill Gokul Gandhi, who is the vice president of the Milwaukee Board of School Directors, was asked about the requirement at a newsmaker luncheon. The reporter asked, part of this city sales tax agreement was that police officers would be put in place in MPS. Did that happen last year? To which Director Gokul Gandhi responded, it did not. The reporter followed up by asking, is it going to happen this year? To which Director Gokul Gandhi responded, we're just going to continue to focus on restorative justice as the main lever of servicing our kids. That's my commitment. The reporter responded asking, is the state going to let you do that? To which Director Gokul Gandhi responded, I mean, you just said that we missed the deadline, and then she kind of laughed it off. The question the reporter asked was, is the state going to let you do that? But the reporter probably should have asked, is Will going to let you do that? And the answer to that question is no. School boards cannot decide that they do not want to follow the law simply because it doesn't fit within their own political agenda or what they think is the best path forward for their school. Will connected with an MPS mother of 6 who was equally concerned about the flippant response to a need for safety in MPS and how blatantly the law was being ignored. We signed her on as a client and filed our complaint on October 8th, 2024. The relief we were asking for was not money or any type of benefit to us or to our client, but rather just a request for the court to compel public officials to do what is legally required by law for them to do. There's a fancy legal term for this, and it's called a writ of mandamus. On January 23rd, 2025, over a year after these school resource officers were supposed to be in MPS, we went to court. The judge granted our writ of mandamus, ordering MPS to follow the law. The judge also ordered that the city of Milwaukee be joined, since the statute requires that MPS and the city of Milwaukee agree to split the cost of these school resource officers. We came back to court 3 weeks later, and the city and MPS had done nothing to get officers in MPS. They had not even agreed on how to split the costs, much less taken any steps to train or assign any of these officers to schools. Therefore, the judge ordered that costs be split 50-50 and gave them 2 more weeks to comply. We were back in court after those 2 weeks, and the judge ruled that MPS had taken all steps it could to cooperate with his rulings, but that the city had not. In fact, the city scheduled all of their meetings to vote and approve the contract with MPS and hire these officers after the court imposed deadline. For those reasons, the court found the city of Milwaukee in contempt and ordered them to pay a $1,000 a day fine until they were in compliance. If the city could become compliant by March 17th, he would forgive the $1,000 a day fine. And wouldn't you know it, officers arrived to their assigned schools and were completely trained by the new deadline, which was March 17th, 2025. While it should not have taken a mother who is living in fear every day for her children that something bad would happen and that MPS would not be prepared to handle it to bring this lawsuit, she is happy with the outcome of this case. And one other key takeaway from this case is that Will is here to ensure that these local districts are following the law. So that's a highlight from the local level. But moving on to a state level issue, we have Wisconsin State Legislature versus DPI. This has to do with Act 20. So, just as some background, in 2023, improving early literacy and reading outcomes became a top priority for the Wisconsin legislature. To achieve this, lawmakers aim to replace outdated methods like 3Qing with more of a back to the basics approach, science of reading, which emphasizes more of phonics and foundational skills. States that have adopted this back to basics approach have seen significant improvements, and Flanders alluded to this a little bit earlier in our presentation, but in just 6 years, Mississippi rose from 49th to 9th in fourth grade reading proficiency, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. And to achieve similar outcomes here in Wisconsin, a package of 3 laws was enacted. Act 20, which creates the Reading and Literacy Improvement Programs, Act 19, which was the Wisconsin state budget, which earmarked the funds to implement the Act 20 programs, and Act 100, which creates accounts to hold and distribute the funds necessary to implement Act 20. DPI was to award grants to school boards, independent charter schools, and private schools that adopted recommended curriculum that contains the components of science-based early reading instruction that does not include 3Qing. The money for these grants was earmarked in Act 19 for this purpose and deposited into the Joint Committee of Finances, or JCF's, supplemental account. Act 100 was passed to create the structure for DPI to expend these funds allocated by Act 19 as they were transferred by the JCF, but did not actually put any money into those accounts. The idea was that curricula would be recommended to DPI by an early literacy council. DPI would submit those recommendations to JCF for final approval. JCF, who held the funds that were appropriated in the state budget, Act 19, would approve the suggested materials and put the funds into the designated accounts. When Act 100 reached Governor Evers' desk, he exercised a partial veto to strike certain words and phrases without vetoing the entire bill. His power to do this is only available to the Wisconsin governor on bills that appropriate funding. And Act 100 on its face does not actually designate any money. Rather, it just creates the accounts. So, in essence, the governor contends that the legislature was trying to improperly exercise executive power by determining which particular programs would be funded, rather than just giving the appropriation to DPI as an executive branch agency to decide on which particular literacy programs would be funded. On the other hand, lawmakers that passed the bill assert that the distinct funding streams were intentional to prevent DPI from having complete discretion over all of the funds. Specifically, the legislature was concerned that DPI would fund programs that did not advance the purposes of Act 20, and that it was the legislature's role to set education policy for the state and part of determining which particular literacy programs should be funded, which is what Act 100 was trying to do, is create these separate funding accounts so that they would have some control over that. The Wisconsin legislature decided to sue Governor Evers over his partial veto, which took all the distinct funding streams in Act 100 and basically made it one big account for DPI to just use. And they argued that the governor shouldn't have been allowed to exercise the partial veto in the first place, since Act 100 was only creating the separate funding streams and not actually appropriating funds. DPI then filed a counterclaim asserting that DPI should receive the $50 million appropriated by the legislature directly rather than that money going to the JCF supplemental funding account as appropriated by Act 19. Then, on August 27, 2024, a circuit court judge in Dane County ruled that even though no money was allocated in Act 100, Act 100, 19, and 20 should be viewed together as part of a unified whole. When examined together, the court concluded that the acts do allocate money, and therefore the partial veto was constitutional under Act 100 because it was part of an appropriations bill package. But despite upholding the governor's veto, the Dane County Circuit Court also determined that there was not a constitutional violation in allowing JCF to continue to hold the funds in this supplemental account. The legislature appealed this decision to the Wisconsin's Court of Appeals. However, on October 29, 2024, Wisconsin Attorney General Josh Kaul filed a petition on behalf of DPI to bypass the Court of Appeals and go straight to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. That petition was granted on January 24th, 2025. An oral argument was before the Wisconsin Supreme Court on April 3rd, 2025. It was also Justice Ann Walsh Bradley's final day of oral arguments, so this was the last one that she heard. During these arguments, the court focused on two main issues. One, whether putting money in the JCF supplemental funds account was appropriate in this situation. And two, whether the Governor Evers' veto was constitutional. We will likely have a decision in early summer on this case before the court switches over and Ann Walsh Bradley retires. Another statewide issue that's been developing recently is the lowering of standards by DPI. And again, Dr. Flanders alluded to this quite a bit in the beginning part of this presentation, but I'm going to talk a little bit about AB1 specifically. So this all began back in 2021 when DPI lowered the cut scores on the state's report cards, artificially boosting ratings and allowing more schools and districts to receive higher grades without actually improving their performance. As a result, there were 0 districts that fall into the fails to meet expectations category. The new report card cut points also pushes districts out of the meets few expectations and pushes others into exceeds expectations. If we had all of our old cut points, 66 fewer districts would be counted as exceeding expectations, and 66 more would meet few expectations. To demonstrate the impact of these changes, Will identified 14 schools on the most recent report card that fall below 15% in ELA, yet are categorized as meets expectations. 15% in ELA and is categorized as meets expectations. In 2024, then, DPI made changes to the labels assigned to student outcome categories on the state's Ford exam, which Flanders was talking about earlier. While this change may seem innocuous, the new terms are misleading to parents and downplay the need for improvement. For example, the lowest performance category shifted from below basic to developing. The second lowest score was changed from basic to approaching. DPI argues that these new terms promote a growth mindset and that the old terms could be perceived as insulting. But consider this. Which of these labels would give you as a parent or as a school member a greater sense of urgency that your child or the students in your district may need support or attention to succeed? Lastly, it's important to note that two previous terms were aligned with the terminology on the NAEP scores on the national report card, and now they are not. Perhaps the most significant change happened in 2024 when DPI lowered the cut points on the Wisconsin Ford exam as part of the standards rewrite. This not only lowered proficiency standards, but also disrupted the alignment with NAEP, making it harder to compare scores to historical data and national benchmarks. It's important to note that the previous standards that aligned with Wisconsin national standards were instituted in 2012 by then DPI Superintendent Tony Evers. Assembly Bill 1 represents a critical gap in restoring the ability of parents, policymakers, and taxpayers to accurately assess the performance of Wisconsin schools. Having consistent, reliable information allows policymakers, educators, and their families to better identify what's working and find areas for improvement to develop strategies to deliver the best possible educational outcomes for students. While Wisconsin students and parents deserve the truth, lowering the bar does not help kids. It just hides failure. At a time when we should be laser focused on tracking recovery from pandemic learning loss, DPI has instead chosen to manipulate the data to cover up for poor academic results. Parents, educators, and policymakers need to be honest and transparent to ensure students are truly prepared for the future, not just given a false sense of success. And Assembly Bill 1 would have taken a meaningful step to put the state back on track. This bill passed the Assembly and it passed the Senate, but it was vetoed by Governor Evers on March 28th. In his veto message, Governor Evers explained that this bill would have required tests in English, reading, and math. God forbid. Additionally, he objects because he objects to the legislature's attempts to, quote, undermine the constitutional authority and independence of the state superintendent of public instruction. He continues by saying, quote, under the Wisconsin Constitution, the state superintendent of public instruction is responsible for supervising Wisconsin's public schools, not the legislature or the governor. This bill intrudes on the decisions about our kids, our classrooms, and our schools that the Constitution and the people of Wisconsin entrust into the duly elected state superintendent, end quote. He concludes his veto message by saying, with this bill, the legislature attempts to override the state superintendent by permanently freezing school scorecard and standard metrics. So, unfortunately for Wisconsin families and students, these new standards that dilute any metric for accountability still stand in our state. Moving on to our national education legal update, the topic that has been much of the discussion recently, the dismantling of the Department of Education. I'm just going to give a quick overview of where things stand. Unfortunately, I have to give a lot of legal answers right now on what's going on. It depends because we don't have a lot of information on how this is going to work. So, on March 3rd of this year, Secretary of Education Linda McMahon put out a statement titled Our Department's Final Mission, sparking rumors that the department would be dismantled. Then, on March 5th, a draft of the executive order to eliminate the Department of Education was shared with the Wall Street Journal. On March 11th, the Department of Education initiated a reduction in workforce, or RIF, that reduced the department's workforce by over 50%. And then finally, on March 20th, 2025, the Trump administration put out an executive order titled, quote, Improving Education Outcomes by Empowering Parents, States, and Communities. Under this executive order, the Secretary of Education must take all steps necessary to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education. To do this, the authority over education will be given back to states and local communities while ensuring effective and uninterrupted delivery of services, programs, and benefits on which Americans rely. There's nothing in this executive order that has a date on when exactly this is supposed to happen by, but schools should be aware that this change is potentially coming. There's a little bit of discussion about whether or not President Trump can dismantle the Department of Education via executive order, but this is something that's going to continue to play out and it's not going away anytime soon. I do just want to emphasize that Dr. Flanders and I did put out an op-ed in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel on Sunday that talks about some of the programs in the Department of Education that will not be going away, that people do not need to worry about. And those two things in particular are student loans and disability services. Student loans and disability services will be taken over by other departments in our federal government. And as the executive order emphasizes, there should be effective and uninterrupted delivery of those services, even in a transition to some of the oversight to our state governments. So, in conclusion, just to wrap everything up, there has been a reduction in the Department of Education that's ushering in a new era of state freedom for public education. But public school improvement is challenged by our DPI hiding the areas that need improvement by changing the scores, and Governor Evers is empowering the DPI to continue doing this by vetoing AB 1. Wisconsin's position as a leader in school choice is in jeopardy with some of the developments that are going on right now, both in our Wisconsin Supreme Court as well as across the country. And just as a final note, I did want to mention that Will is having their Wisconsin School Board Summit on May 9th. The QR code on your screen allows you to just hover your phone over it and it will take you to the registration link. We'll be diving into a lot of the topics that have been covered today during that summit at more length with some really wonderful speakers from across the nation. So with that, I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lauren. I don't know if anyone, we'll take the opportunity to give it a couple minutes here if anyone has any questions. Again, you can use the Q&A system that's set up here to ask those. We'll give it a few seconds, but if not, seeing none, we're going once, going twice. Yeah, I guess we'll conclude.
We do have one question that just came in.
I'm sorry, I didn't see it in there. I apologize.
What are we going to do if NAEP goes away?
So that's a good question. So, the NAEP is certainly useful to us in a lot of the analyses that we do. It allows for comparisons between states, like we were just discussing, comparisons with Mississippi and other states. While certainly not a core function of the federal government, right? If we're trying to move back to things the federal government should be doing, it's certainly selfishly data that we like to utilize. I think in the hypothetical absence of NAEP, and I will note that the plan so far is for NAEP to continue, though some folks that sort of administer the NAEP have said they might not have the funding to do so. So it's a little ambiguous as to whether it will continue or not. But in a hypothetical where NAEP doesn't continue, I think the service that's provided by having a comparable benchmark across the country will be something that's worthwhile for another organization, a private organization, to pick up. We have examples of that in the past with things like the Iowa test. These are different tests that are administered in different parts of the country. In certain states, they take that exam. So I think there will be a nationally norm referenceable test, even in the absence of NAEP. But again, selfishly, that's one area that I think it would be useful if it did continue.
And then, Will, we're getting a little bit of a reverb from you too. We're getting some background noise, so on your microphone. So, next question that just came in: since we have to follow the law, what is the current status of Title IX issues?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking it. We actually hosted a webinar on March 12th that specifically discusses Title IX and what's going on with the Department of Education with regards to Title IX. That's available online on Will's YouTube page. But just to give a really quick answer to that here as well, Title IX actually existed before the Department of Education existed. If OCR, which is the Office of Civil Rights, under the Department of Education no longer handles Title IX complaints as a result of the Department of Education being dismantled, it will likely be handled by the Department of Justice or some other task force under the federal government. So Title IX is not going anywhere. And then the other really important thing to know about Title IX is the shift from the Biden-Harris 2024 Title IX rule back to the 2020 Title IX rule, which was under the Trump administration. So several courts now actually have found that that 2024 Title IX rewrite is unconstitutional and it has been vacated. So currently the 2020 Title IX rule is the one that's governing, and it's important for school districts who potentially adopted the 2024 Title IX updates to go back and ensure that their current Title IX policy is in line with the 2020 Title IX rule.
Great. Next question is coming up is, obviously there's been some stories in the news about DPI refusing to follow the Trump administration's executive orders related to DEI. What is going to or likely to happen with regard to that?
Yeah, that's another great question. So obviously there have been a couple of executive orders about DEI, and we actually at Will have an entire section of attorneys and projects dedicated to this issue, which is called Equality Under the Law. That's headed up by our Deputy Counsel and Vice President Dan Lennington. And what we've been telling school board members is that there is a link if you think that there's something going on in your school district that they still have DPI against the executive order or against federal law that discriminates on the basis of race. You can either contact us directly, and my email and Flanders' email is right there on the screen right now, or the federal government has actually set up a link online where you can submit complaints about your school district not following the DEI standards, and you can just fill in the questions that they have on that link, which we would be happy to share with you if you want to reach out to us. We can point you in the right direction there. Obviously, it's disappointing that DPI wants to continue programs or to support any kind of racial segregation or discrimination in any schools, and we are keeping our eyes out for any issues that are going on with Title VI and the DEI process right now.
Great. One other question came in terms of getting a picture of performance. This question for Dr. Flanders. Between years, does using district ranking within a year make sense?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that there is, so first of all, what we're doing in the apples to apples report is just looking at 1 year. But obviously, the overtime picture is probably most useful, right? If we can do that. Unfortunately, DPI's changes to the report card make that impossible. We have a blog that we put out that tries to help districts to normalize their data from previous years. I'm happy to link you guys to that. It's something we can't do. It would require student level data that we don't have access to. But there is a path to go back to the previous data, but it's still just an estimate. Because of the changes to the standards, we can't be sure exactly how comparable it is. I will note in that testimony that I alluded to, DPI says they're going to come out with a way for districts to do this, to sort of make those comparisons across years. Haven't seen it yet, but I think it would be useful if they did create that, and we'll definitely be on it if that does happen to actually exist. So seeing no more questions, I will thank everyone for attending today. And again, as Lauren mentioned, our email addresses are on the screen here. So please feel free to follow up if you have any further questions. And thank everyone so much. Have a great afternoon.